Hello, and welcome to the formal review. Today we'll be talking about the 2021 film Candyman. So sit back, relax, grab your drinks, and let's talk about this movie.
What's up, y'all, and welcome back to the formal review. This is season 4, episode 14, and I thank you all for tuning in once again. So this episode will be analysis on the new Candyman film, but also on the 1992 original and why that film still holds up to this day. So stay tuned to find out if this new film can measure up to the original.
Have you ever thought about starting your own podcast? When I was trying to get this podcast off the ground, I had a lot of questions, like how do I record an episode? How do I get my show into all the apps that people like to listen on? How do I make money from my podcast? The answer to every single one of those questions is really simple. Anchor. Anchor is a one-stop shop for recording, hosting, and distributing my podcast. And best of all, it's absolutely 100% free and ridiculously easy to use. And now Anchor can match you with some great sponsors. That means you can get paid to podcast right away. In fact, that's exactly what I'm doing right now. So if you've always wanted to start a podcast and make money doing it, go to anchor.fm/start to join me and the diverse community of podcasters already using Anchor. Again, that's anchor.fm/start. And I can't wait to hear your podcast.
Now, before I get started on anything, I do want to preface this episode and say I will have two sections in this analysis. The first one will be a spoiler-free, just giving a general analysis of the film and not ruin anything as much as I can. And then toward the end, there'll be a more in-depth analysis of the two films and the importance of them. And that part will definitely ruin the movie for you if you haven't seen it. And if you don't care about that, you can always keep listening. But I will definitely say that prior to that section, you should go watch at least the new film before hearing that part of the analysis, because it could ruin the movie for. But if you don't care about that, you can just keep listening on. Also,
I know I talk about this at the end, but the data shows that most people don't listen to that part, so I want to talk about it here and reiterate the importance of leaving reviews on your favorite subscription services. I do read those because I do want to grow, because these episodes are really for all you listeners out there, and I want to keep this entertaining. So what do you want to hear? Do you want to hear games? Do you want to hear more of the 4K stuff? Do you want to hear me talk about a certain movie? If you want to come on and talk to me about something, if you want to debate, I'm always open to do stuff like that. So you can always reach out to me on social media. I always want to grow and improve, and
just because something works doesn't mean that it cannot be improved.
So if there's something that you want me to improve on, let me know, and I will grow as such. Anyway,
now let's get on to the movies at hand. So sit back, relax, grab your drinks. Let's talk about these movies. So Candyman is a supernatural horror film directed by Nia DaCosta and written by Jordan Peele, Wynn Rosenfeld, and DaCosta herself. It stars Yaha Abdul-Mateen II, Teyonah Parris, Nathan Stewart Jarrett, and Coleman Domingo, along with Tony Jaa, Virginia Madsen, and Vanessa Estelle Williams reprising their roles from the original film. Now, even with this film being the fourth film in the overall Candyman film franchise, it is only a direct sequel to the first film, so that's the only film that I will be analyzing in this episode. So in this new film, Abdul-Mateen II is this up-and-coming black artist named Anthony, who lives in this luxury apartment with his girlfriend Brianna, played by Harris, who is this successful gallery director. Now, the building that they live in was once the notorious Cabrini Green public housing complex from the original film, which then brings up theme of gentrification plus other, which I'll go into in a little bit. This new film was supposed to be released in September of 2020, but then it was pushed back to October 16th, but then was further postponed, and obviously with the pandemic happening, it never really made it to theaters until now. The wait was 100% worth it. This film is absolutely thrilling, and what really works about this film is that it looks at the one-note characters whose original purpose in the first film was to just move the plot along for this white protagonist. Now, DaCosta and Peele, who are able to reframe this tale, but through a very different lens. As with Bernard Rose's original film, it explores explores ideas through the American lens of the Black experience. Now, unlike Rose's film, this time it is told by Black filmmakers and protagonists, and the difference at times is profound. Now, honestly, one could go back and forth whether the first one or this one is a better film, and it honestly touches base in a similar way to Blade Runner and Blade Runner 2049. Both of them work exactly well, and one could really just say that the reason why the original is better is because you don't have the sequel without the first film. And the original is almost perfect when it comes to cinematic effects, and some of them may be a little outdated, and the new film does look better. But DaCosta upgrades the film without hurting the film's original imagery. She gives a lot of very unnerving cinematography, and her composer, Robert A. Lau, supplements every portion of her film. Now, the 1992 film was originally based on Clive Barker's short story, The Forbidden, and the film follows this Chicago graduate who's working on this thesis on urban legends and folklore, which then leads her to this legend of Candyman, who is the ghost of an artist and son of an enslaved person who was murdered in the late 19th century for his relationship with a daughter of a wealthy white man. So the short story actually was first published back in 1985 in Stephen Jones' horror fiction semi-prozine Fantasy Tales. However, it did not come out with Barker's name until its appearance in his Books of a Blood anthology series. Now, in this semi-prozine, prior to The Forbidden, is this 2-page spread that announces the story's title and gives an illustration of the story's supernatural villain. Now, originally, Barker imagined the creature as this waxy, jaundiced skin with rogue cheeks, blue lips, and eyes like rubies, and patchwork coat. But Fantasy Tales artist Jon Stewart gives more of a beastly man looks in a silhouette with this wild hair and a far more elaborate hook hand. Now, in this image, bees do surround the creature as he stands in this graffiti-lined doorway, and next to him are the razor blades and sweets image that would later appear in the film version. Now, the original was made after director Bernard Rose and Barker met, and Barker agreed to license the rights to make this film. The original story revolves around the themes of the British class system in contemporary Liverpool. Now, Rose chose to move the story to Chicago and focus more on themes of race and social class in the inner city United States. And this film was thematically released on October 16, 1992 by TriStar Pictures and Polygram Film Entertainment. It, at the time, got generally positive reviews and grossed over $25 million in the US. Now, on Rotten Tomatoes today, an approval rating of 76% based on 70 critic reviews and an average rating of 6.6 out of 10. Their critic consensus states, though ultimately it sacrificed some mystery in the name of gory thrills, Candyman is this nuanced, effectively chilling tale that benefits from an interesting premise and some fine performances. Now, on Metacritic, it has a weighted average of 61 out of 100 based on 15 critics, which is generally favorable reviews. Now, that's about the same between the two biggest sites when it comes to rating of films. Now, this film is a follow-up to that story, and it's not simply an exploitation of an established film that just throws in some cheap jump scares and makes some money doing it. This film doubles down on the roots of generational violence and also racially inspired violence, and it takes that aspect of the Candyman lore and looks at it more deeply and adds in issues, like I said, as gentrification and the effects on the neighborhood, and also the effects of generational violence, not only on victims but on people as a whole. Now this film isn't only a societal critique, but it also works really well as a good horror film. There are some really creative kill sequences and fantastic blood effects that aren't all CGI. The film uses very inventive staging, suspense, drama, and really can get the audience invested in all of the characters. And DaCosta herself produces some really fantastic camera work and visual tricks. Now, personally, I am not a fan of jump scares because honestly, they're predictable. The fact that this film has very minimal and yet it still manages to creep me out makes the film so much more respectable. It's not only about the violence or only about the societal message. It's about the characters and the legend of who Candyman is, and it adds so many levels to the overall story that it just makes the original film so much better. Now, if one has not seen the first Candyman film, or it's been a while since the last viewing, rewatching it will help a lot with this film. It's not required, but the story is just going to be that much better if one has the original's ideas fresh in their mind. There are some very intricate ideas and callback that one will only really appreciate if you do see the original first. The cast is absolutely outstanding, but Abdul Mateen II steals the scene, and he's honestly one of the most underrated actors in Hollywood, and he's been in very big budget films at this point. And he's able to show Anthony's descent into insanity, and one can really feel everything about him from fear to happiness. Paris is also fantastic, and her backstory is an essential aspect to the narrative, but I'm not going to spoil that here. And Domingo is really the one who makes the film feel very contemporary, especially when he says,
"They love what we make, but not us."
Referring to how many black artists in general have been exploited by white people. It really honestly cuts deeper than really Candyman's hook hand may have. And honestly, having Jordan Peele involved definitely helped, but DaCosta is really the leader here in this film and establishes it from the start of it. Now, good horror films, like the rest of the art of filmmaking, have to be able to beat the test of time, especially with horror films. There's a lot of empty feelings. Yes, they're entertaining, but they do very little aside from that. Now, this film doesn't do that and applies the many themes that will have one thinking about the film after they leave the theater. If one is going to view the inclusion of these themes as a flaw in the film, they're really ignorant of the roots of the franchise as they were present in the original. Yes, the sequels after that went into this typical slasher genre, but the original was much more legendary than it's really given credit for. It has something to say instead of just an unbeatable entity whose only motive is killing teenagers on her lake or in their dreams. So before the spoiler section, if one is a fan of the original film, the film picks up wonderfully after that one. And if one is a horror fan, there's a lot of extremely creative kills. And then as a film fan, it is amazingly written and amazingly filmed. Now, here's your final spoiler warning. The next portion of the analysis is going to be full spoilers of both films and will demonstrate why it is a big step above the average horror film. And in short, the main reason is because it gives these normal human characters more development. Okay, so this is your final warning. All right, it's gonna be full on spoilers now. So the biggest reason is that this film takes the story behind the Candyman character and then modernizes it. The film shows how there's been so much injustice, brutality, and cruelty in this neighborhood, which also could be applied to the outside world, that Candyman has essentially been many different people, and each version of the character adds to the legend, but the overlap between them is that they are a product of the brutality of injustice, not just police brutality, but in a full entity, injustice toward people of color and specifically African Americans. It also then answers one of the original film's biggest questions of why does Candyman attack the people living there, as they are similar to him and they're also struggling. And this is because he's trying to bring the attention to the violence and injustice that exists in these neighborhoods. And this is because population has really been kind of pushed in there by other people of power, and mainly people of color live there. And this film takes Candyman and makes him this literal entity to represent prejudice and racism, where the original was more about cultural appropriation. The original story follows Helen Lyle, who's played by Virginia Madsen, who's this grad student writing this thesis about the Candyman urban legend, which is kind of somewhat spread through white suburbia, although supposedly it originated in this nearby community mostly filled up with African Americans. So these urban legends represent modern original oral folklore designed to quote unquote stroke fears of urban society, as Helen's husband states. He's essentially arguing that Candyman is not any different from albino alligators in the New York sewers, except that in general urban legends are difficult to validate. Really, these kind of urban legends build from rumor and he essentially is saying that the entire story's been exaggerated, and it then brings into the question of his tragic past and thus America's history of racial violence. As such, Helen becomes extremely interested in this myth, and she attempts to figure out how and why it persists on. Helen herself is a complex character who is looking for the humanity behind her studies. Now, it does show in the film that she doesn't always do the research and misses some of the important information. She doesn't even research the Miss backstory that Candyman was the son of a slave who was well educated and raised in quote-unquote polite society, and as a portrait painter he was able to get money to be okay, and then he ended up painting the daughter of a wealthy white family. Now the daughter and the painter fell in love and she became pregnant. Now the father sent a mob which then proceeded to chop off Candyman's right hand and feed his body to bees that stung him to death. Now in the film there's no explanation of why Candyman only attacks when his name is said 5 times in a mirror, and the sequel doesn't really touch on that either, but that's not the purpose of it. That's honestly a nitpick if you really want to push on it. But the story that keeps Helen going down this rabbit hole is the story of forbidden love in the face of racial cruelty. The film then progresses to emphasize the differences between white and those living in lower income neighborhoods are simply this social illusion. Now this first depiction of this comes when Helen learns that she's paid a fortune to live in this apartment complex that was built with the identical floor plan as the lower income neighborhood Cabrini Green, and the only difference between them is the higher price tag and the people living there. Now this shows her and the audience that if something was so awful and could happen a few blocks away, why couldn't it happen to her? Now Helen here represents white liberal protagonists who want to help but know very little of the struggle of people of color, specifically African Americans. After Candyman kills several of Helen's friends, the authorities blame her, arrest her, and place her into a mental institution. Now Candyman suggests that because of their shared experience of prosecution, they will live together forever in spirit. Now, at the end of the film, Candyman arranges essentially for Helen to be burned alive to experience the same mob violence that led to his own death. And again, this brings the film full circle into her wondering at the beginning of the film, why couldn't it happen to her? Personally, when I saw this film as a younger person, I thought it was a creepy slasher flick, but that's it. As an adult, this film has a lot more in it than a simple slasher film about urban legends. It's a layered observation of racial fear and this idea of gentrification. When Helen and her friend originally visit Cabrini Green, they're incredibly fearful of the locals.
What's with the arsenal, Bernadette? We're only going 8 blocks.
You're the one who got us dressed up like cops.
I just said dress conservatively.
No, we look like cops.
Why are you trying to scare me?
I'm not trying to scare you, Helen. I just want you to think, okay? The gangs hold this whole neighborhood hostage.
But the locals are just as afraid of her because they think that she's a cop.
You not the police? Huh?
Look like 5-0 to me. Ask Blondie where she going.
Who she going to see? Who you going to see?
Come on.
Where you all going now?
Hands up, people! 5-0, coming out the back door! Police!
Now, when Candyman sets her up for a kidnapping, this rich white lady gets to experience what it is like for people to assume that you're a criminal and for people to be afraid of you. And this symbolizes herself with how many people of color feel. And many people can assume that they, or in this case, Helen, is the source of violence because of their proximity to the source of violence. Now, her life obviously ends with this self-sacrifice to literally give back to the community because of how she sees the struggle that they go through. Now, even though she becomes this kind of myth herself, the audience still feels for her because the original film builds her up with compassion and having an interest in social justice. Now, the final scene shows how both her and Candyman have a form of empowerment. They control the fear that they evoke and are able to have revenge and also restore some of the decency that was robbed from them. Now, one could say that this film does equate lynch mob violence with what Helen went through. Yes, Helen was institutionalized for murder, lost her husband to a younger woman, and eventually burning is pretty bad. But obviously, Candyman's death was far, far worse. Either way though, Candyman represents humanity at its worst. One, not only for loving a white woman, but also was horribly murdered for just that. Tragically, Candyman has become this myth that takes some form of delight in being this feared entity in his community. It makes sense, as his violence and fear are the only things that make an impact in America that has had centuries of oppression. You see, like, when you look at all these neighborhoods, why is it that certain populations of people don't do anything until they see something horrible happen? Now, when the film was released in 1992, the film also looked at stereotypes given neighborhoods like Cabrini had that were actually more dangerous than the places themselves. Now, especially today, after the George Floyd riots of last year in 2020, this film can speak to a lot of people of color for taking control of their fate through protests, because Candyman himself represents the idea of this so-called black boogeyman. As long as his legend and these stereotypes exist, and as long as people believe them, he will continue to murder people. And this is similar to how a black kid walking home in a hoodie with a package of Skittles makes one wants to stop him and eventually kill him, or a black man with a hoodie that may make you clutch your purse when you see him getting on the bus next to you. Fear creates something to fear. Now, cinematically, Rose and his cinematographer Anthony B. Richmond really give some fantastic and haunting Chicago imagery that they do replicate fairly well in the new film. And additionally, Candyman himself is a wonderful combination of practical effects and actual beats. During this rewatch, I learned that Todd really filled his mouth with buzzing insects for that climactic kiss. And additionally, Philip Glass's brilliant hypnotic score is absolutely amazing, and one can really see how this score had a huge influence on Jordan Peele and his desire for his films. However, there is very little development for any people of color in the film outside of the maybe young Jake, especially when this film is centered in a neighborhood that has a lot of people of color. Again, when one looks at this film by itself without the sequel and prior to seeing the sequel, it seems a little odd that Candyman only kills people living in Cabrini Green. Arguably, one could see maybe the myth isn't one out of this population, and yes, they're somewhat inadvertently living on top of his ashes. Still, why is he hurting his own people? It would make more sense for him to take his vengeance out on people who look like his oppressors. Now, the racism that got this character killed in the 1890 is the same one that powered slavery, and the same prejudices and the stereotypes that have led people to come up with.
They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy.
Now, the original film doesn't really give any background to what caused his love for killing, and it's not really known what would happen if he was a decent man in his past, or if the circumstances of his death were the things that turned him evil. However, that's what makes the message and themes of this film a lot more obvious. He must represent something more and become this representative of America's vast history of racism. And this is the idea of what the new film develops more into. Like Peele's horror films, it's a really smart way to tell a horror story and provide a relevance that continues to this day, unfortunately. Now, the original film's strongest point is obviously the title character himself. Tony Todd is absolutely stunning and frightening as Candyman, from his voice to his really shudder-inducing stare. He's a legend, and he really brought this gravitas to the role and the character more than just this general slasher film. Now, in the new film, you find out that his actual name was Daniel Robitaille, who was the son of the slave men in the early 1900s, and the same story kind of plays out. Now, the film develops more of the character and shows that even how the so-called Uncle Tom, or a free black man who was intelligent and a talented person, can still have problems. As the film states, he's good enough to be in the proximity of wealth and whiteness, but being with a white woman falls outside of that boundary. And in fact, Candyman shows what racism can be to people of color, a horror story. Now, there's been many instances in history that tell people that they should be afraid of black men for as long as there's been in America. In a political climate where fear and stereotypes stereotypes are really kind of tearing America to shreds, Candyman becomes scarier and more relevant. DaCosta, as the director, gives a lot of gory scares, but well-crafted scenes that show the audience the horrors of injustice. And it shows that Candyman himself is an avenger of sorts, which, unlike the sequels that take him more into this typical slasher, the old neighborhood is no longer there, but Candyman no longer will be victimizing the people who have already been victims. As Domingo's character says, the new occupants are the ones who brought violence into their neighborhood and plunged the property value down so that they can now afford to move in and thus gentrify the location. This now allows Candyman to go against those who have abused the community, such as the police officers who, toward the end of the movie, come in and kill Anthony for no reason. The main theme of this film is that Candyman is a creation of police brutality, and now someone is fighting back. And it shows the audience what it's like to be victimized, similar to what Helen felt in the original film, and what would happen if these victimized people fight back. Sure, there's one could debate here is how the ideas of justice versus the ideas of vengeance, but the film isn't trying to have that conversation. It's only showing how there is a cycle of violence and how for many, many years it's been this one-way street. Now, what will happen if there is a two-way street? Now, one could say that this ends up stating that it's an open season on innocent people of color by police officers. People will say that out of 492 homicides in Chicago last year, 3 involved cops. However, this is not the whole picture. Now, sadly, as of this recording, there has been 523 civilians that have been shot, 104 of whom were people of color. Now, that is about 32%, and it's only from about the first 6 months of 2021. Now, in 2020, there was 1,021 fatal police shootings, and 2019, there were 999. Out of those 1,021 deaths in 2020, there were 457 white victims, which is 45%, 241 black victims, which is 24%, 169 Hispanic victims, which is 17%, 28 who declared as other victims, which is about 3%, and then 126 unknown victims, which is about 12%. Now, numbers are awful to see from any aspect, and yes, all deaths are problematic. But again, this is not the full picture if these are the only numbers looked at. Now, African Americans in general encompass about 13.4% of the American population, whereas whites in general make up 76.5%. That means we have about 251 million white people and 44 million black people. That means in 2020 alone, the white deaths due to police is about 0.00002. So 0.502%. And the black deaths due to police is 0.00006%, which is 0.406, which is 3 times more. So when you do the math for 2021, out of the 523 fatal police shootings, 187 were white, which is 36%, 104 were black, 20%, 56 were Hispanic, 11%, 7 were declared other, which is about 35%, and 169 were unknown, which is 32%. That means in the first half of 2021, the white deaths due to police is about 0.707%, and the black deaths due to police is about 0.402%, which is about 4 times more. Now, if you go back and look in history, in 1963, there were 111 reported deaths for white Americans and 131 for non-white Americans, according to the CDC. Now, the 1960 U.S. Census reported about 179 million people, with about 179,000 being white and 19,000 being black. After you do the math, the police-related death for whites during that time was 0.0004, so that's 3 zeros and the 4%, and the rate for blacks was 0.01, which is 0.101%, which is 25 times higher. Yes, that disparity has gone down from 25 times higher to 4 times higher in the first 6 months, but that still doesn't take away from that disparity between black and white American deaths when the police are involved. And I've said this before in other episodes that even though there's been progress, we still have a long way to go. Now, DaCosta is able to take these numbers and put Candyman as an expression of rage against racism in the era of Black Lives Matter. Candyman himself is a symptom of inequality and bad housing versus gentrification. Now, one could see how Candyman has similar ideas to Lawrence Fishburne's character Furious Styles from Boys in the Hood.
It's what happens when the property value of a certain area is brought down. They can buy the land at a lower price. Then they move all the people out, raise the property value, and sell it at a profit.
And one thing that DaCosta does really well is that she's able to recreate a lot of really, really great cinematic moments in this movie that really put her up there when it comes to dealing with being honorable to the masters of horror, such as when she pulls farther and farther away from a condo large window, which is a nod to Hitchcock's Rear Window. Now, one could say that there's a slight issue with the movie due to its 91-minute runtime, which does give a somewhat rushed act. Now, DaCosta and her co-writers do have a lot going on in their mind. While this overarching theme of the United States' treatment towards people of color is very clear, there are also some other points that are lost despite this message through that last act of the movie, and one can make the argument that Todd's small appearance in the film is a slight flaw, as he is a soul of the original film. I mean, his opening monologue itself is iconic.
They will say that I have shed innocent blood. What's blood for, if not for shedding?
Now, the small absence of him does work for what the story is telling. It gives a glimpse into the cycle of violence toward people of color in America. While it may be less scary than what one would think going into this movie, but it creates an atmosphere that is so painfully true and realistic. And the really impact of this movie really even goes so far into the credits that the animation sequence is absolutely fantastic and really shows what Candyman is and the mythos behind his character. And it's a film about the boogeyman that shows who he is and why he never will leave, which is what makes the film truly horrifying. DaCosta even uses a very disturbing version of Sammy Davis Jr.'s classic The Candyman and really puts together a film that really brings together the real and fictional aspects that really will cause one to remember actual victims of police brutality such as George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. So the film itself succeeds with its story, its characters, its details, and its theme, but struggles slightly on its rushed ending. Now, this film is able to pull off the feat of being worthy of the original, being able to build on it and make it into a coherent saga. This film shows that reboots and sequels that are released decades later aren't necessarily a bad thing if there's a creative and passionate team that has a story and direction to take that story and make it absolutely compelling. Now, what did you think? Is it better or worse or the same as the original?
Let me know. Hit me up on social media. The Formal Review is on Facebook, Twitter, and the Gram, and also YouTube. The handle's all the same. It's at The Formal Review. And for anyone who has supported me on a financial basis, I thank you very much for supporting me in that way. For anyone who wants to support, you can go to anchor.fm/the_formal_review and click support this podcast, and any donation is appreciated. Thank you all again for tuning in. And until next time, wash your hands, get vaccinated, or if not, wear a mask. And I'll see you at the movies.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of The Formal Review. Cheers, and we'll see you next time.